It's not the worst of the CBC, although today's video is inspired by the CBC as I turned it on, but it is just a consistent stream of self-flagellation over Indigenous children and whatnot. So I'm going to go back to what we said on Tuesday on the live stream of the National Telegraph. This is not productive, and I want to outline why. One, this is not productive, but two, more importantly, actually do something productive. All right, I'm declaring this actually Tecumseh Day. It was Wyatt's idea, but this should be National Tecumseh Day. This is a much better idea than Truth and Reconciliation Day, which doesn't really focus on either truth or reconciliation. It just wants to highlight the absolute worst of Native Canadian history, focus on that, and then when we do talk about the positive aspects of culture, it just shows them like dressed up and dancing around, which is like it again. There is never a more cartoonish caricature of the Indigenous people than when we give the left full carte blanche to talk about whatever they want here. So it's basically sadness and then dancing, and it's just this sort of really warped, narrow view on their history that I want to sort of elaborate on, because I think, yeah, Tecumseh Day would be a much better day. And if we learn about the history of the War of 1812 and the role that Tecumseh and the Pan-Indian Army, or Pan-Indian Nation, whatever you want to call it there, did in creating Canada, then I think you have a much more interesting, in-depth view of our Indigenous communities, and then also the tragedy that befall them later. How did they come to, like, essentially defend this country and then fall out of favor with the population? I mean, this is the real interesting story. And this is truth. And I think through truth, you can build reconciliation if that is our goal. I don't really see the goal of the Truth and Reconciliation Day being truth or reconciliation. I see it as sort of, this sort of leftist, sort of one of those, okay, you must comply, right? And it's not about healing Indigenous people. It's about, who self-flagellates hardest, so they're a good person. So the person who wears the orange shirt and beats themselves, Canada evil, well, they're one of the good ones. And this doesn't help any Indigenous people. It just helps people on the left identify the goods and the bads. So Tecumseh Day. Today is actually officially Tecumseh Day. That's what I'm celebrating. On Truth and Reconciliation Day, I will be forming next year. There will be a full-on Tecumseh Day. I guarantee it. We're going to learn about actual history of the Indigenous people and do something productive for truth and reconciliation. So Tecumseh is a very, very interesting figure, because one of the quintessential things about Indigenous history is that they're not all the same. And this is one of the flaws that we tend to make in sort of widespread truth and reconciliation claims is, the Indigenous people, not realizing that, as I always say, the Mi'kmaq are not the Huron are not the Ojibwe are not the Iroquois are not the Algonquin are not the Mi'kmaq. Again, they all had very distinct cultures, and even within them, different tribes within those nations. So the fractious nature of the Indigenous community was well known throughout history. However, along comes a man called Tecumseh and his brother. I'm going to butcher the brother's name. It's hard, much like Takawanese. Sorry. Okay. But they come and they unite all the tribes. This is, you might not like the term being used in modern age, but Tecumseh would have called it Pan-Indianism, right? The entire Indian nation. I know the Indians are from India, but this is what the movement was called. So the Pan-Indian movement, the Pan-Indian Army, is this massive political accomplishment, let's say, by Tecumseh, who is sort of an orator, a warrior, a leader. One of the great men of history is Tecumseh, who unites all the tribes and has them fight on the side of the British for a Indian nation state, Indiana, right? The state of Indiana, mostly the state of Indiana that gets its name. It was supposed to be again the natives allying with the British here and the Canadians would have created a separate nation. The British agreed to sort of essentially build a nation or give that land to the indigenous populations to form a country there. So it's a very interesting character, Tecumseh, in the sense that he is sort of a nationalist, and he does realize the concept and the validity of the nation state, and he also gets all the indigenous tribes to go into it. And the general argument he used was, there's no way these upstart colonists could beat the entire might of the British Empire. That was sort of, because again, you think since like the 1600s, the dominant force in North America was the British Empire. the Indigenous knew, and the natives knew, just how powerful and how mighty the British Empire was. Now, did Tecumseh have a full understanding of the geopolitics of the Napoleonic Wars going on, half the world away? Probably not, so he didn't understand the tie-ins there. But what becomes important to Canada is the fact that as the British are tied down, halfway across the world with Napoleon and fighting a war that's basically an offshoot of the Napoleonic Wars. So I'll explain this because this is sort of how a lot of the natives get screwed over in the end, and just not accounting for the fact that this is an offshoot of the Napoleonic Wars. The reason the Americans are fighting is the British are impressing sailors from the American Navy into American sailors are into their own navy to fight Napoleon. There are some silly tax things that never really mattered anyway, but this is the real focus of the war. So again, when the Napoleonic Wars end, these wars end. So the problem is these wars end in a tie. Because again, they're really an offshoot of the Napoleonic Wars, as there's no need to fight Napoleon, there's no need to impress American sailors. So the primary reason for the anger at the British, they can kind of declare victory, saying they didn't get beat by the British, and they're fine. And the British maintain the St. Lawrence Strait and the trade passages in Canada, so they're fine. So they kind of end in a tie, and the natives do not get what they want because Tecumseh dies in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames. William Henry Harrison and his army kill him, and the Pan-Indian alliance breaks down without him. So this is, a lot of people have problems with great men history, right, where it's more a confluence of different factors than Alexander the Great, let's say, did this, or this person, the Great, did that. But in terms of Tecumseh, you see that the alliance he built breaks down without him. It falls apart. And the fact that the Pan-Indian nation is no more after Tecumseh really, 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 really hurts the natives and is one of the primary reasons why they do get so screwed over in the wake of the War of 1812, because they don't have any bargaining capacity, right? One of the great things Tecumseh did is by uniting all the nations, you had significant bargaining capabilities and political power to make sure that the British would keep their promises, right? Politics is about power and leverage and what you can't do, right? And an entire united Indigenous army and nation had immense political power, and probably could, if Tecumseh had survived the war, probably might have been able to negotiate for Manitoba instead of Manitoba or Saskatchewan now. That might be an independent Indigenous nation state. We don't know. But the odds of it happening with Tecumseh are a lot higher than without, as you see, because they break down into individual tribes. So who are the British loyal to? Again, and the state they had promised them was in the American Indiana. So that needed to be renegotiated. However, who's going to negotiate for it, right? As soon as Tecumseh died, the infighting individual tribes started up again. And, they were unable to unite. So the reason why this is so important is, if you look at what he did, this essentially saved Canada, or created Canada. The War of 1812 was sort of the beginning of Canadian nationalism, because you have the Americans coming up from the South and trying to invade and conquer and say, we're going to make you America, right? And then you have this sort of faraway, we had good ties with the British Empire, right? There had to sort of be a choice being made. This is the first time there's sort of a cognitive forced into a choice of like, okay, no. Canada is something separate. We need our own nation. We need to have our own defenses. We need to be reliant on ourselves. And the people who sort of held the line originally, right before the British could fully mobilize and get troops into Canada to stave off the American invasion, were Tecumseh's army, right? In 1813, when Laura Secord does her famous walk, that's like the Canadian version of Paul Revere. She walks, 35 kilometers after hearing that the Americans are going to attack the British forces at it's a very Canadian name, Beaver Ridge or something, Beaver Lake, Beaver something, right? But who does she walk to and warn? She walks to a bunch of Mohawk warriors. So she knew the alliance were Mohawk, right? So that is, right, that is, a great story of the War of 1812. So you have this story of, okay, the Indigenous sort of who they are, right? They're many different nations. They're not one, but they are one nation for a year. They get fully united, right? They essentially defend Canada, but their leader dies in the middle of this, and the unity breaks apart. And as they are not united, it's much easier for the British to then take advantage of them. As the fears of American invasion grow and the Americans push westward. The British government starts settling more and more people westward and westward. This then starts causing friction between the indigenous community and the new settlers who are not there to be, for the most part, have the alliances with the indigenous in the War of 1812. So this is where it breaks down. And the final thing I'll say on Tecumseh Day is Tecumseh and Brock got along quite fine. Isaac Brock, you might remember, Brock University. One of the horrible things that still survives to this day, and in a large part probably survives, and it is a key part of the CBC narrative, is sort of the noble savage myth, or the horrible thing I learned in university from the leftists is we tricked the natives. So they were tricked. They didn't understand contracts or land ownership. They didn't understand politics. This is all lies. This is lies. The way Tecumseh took Detroit and Brock took Detroit is Tecumseh played off of this. Tecumseh understood that people were racist and can be made to think negative assumptions. So essentially they did the thing where they put the women and children in canoes around the city. He told his warriors to just look crazy, just stand there and not blink, right? And then Brock told the Canadians to kind of look afraid of the Indigenous. So they go in and they created this whole false panic where Tecumseh goes in, and then who's a very, very intelligent man, but looks like a crazy person. And Brock goes up to the leader of Detroit. He's like, listen, you're going to have to give me the city because I'm trying to protect you from these people right here. And if you give me the city, I can protect you, right? So they tricked the Americans out of Detroit by just looking crazy, right? So they didn't understand politics. They didn't understand. They were tricked. They were they understood politics. They understood warfare. They understood trade. They understood all of this. They just got beat by, a superior force in most cases, or traded away, different rights or lands because there's lots of land, the different things they gave for tons of natural resources they thought would give them a competitive advantage over other tribes. There's a lot more to say here, but I think this is a lot better of a narrative. Because one, it's the truth, but when you understand what Indigenous history is in context, isn't this really the story of people who really have a stake in this nation and got screwed out of it historically? Indigenous Canadians have every right to be as proud of this country and feel just as involved in it as what we would term old stock Canadians, because they really are. And the tragedy is the Indian Act and going forward and all that, right? But what set the situation for this? It's all this, and it's really the story of once brothers in arms betrayed, and they deserve their due, which is not indefinite detention on reserves, but rather a fair and equal stake in the nation that they helped build. And that is our first ever Tecumseh Day, coming to you next year. Every day that the left tries to destroy Indigenous people by turning them into just silly caricatures of a noble savage, we will be there teaching real history and actually pushing for truth, which hopefully leads to reconciliation. That is our real goal here at my YouTube channel. That and destroy the windmills. Good night.